Our keynote speakers today is Professor Stephen Krashen and Dr. Nooshan Ashtari, and they will be presenting about heritage language development, the advantages, the problems, and the solution. And as we can read in the abstract, development of heritage language leads to cognitive, academic, and practical advantages, as well as the ability to profit from the wisdom of both cultures, and it has no disadvantages. But all too often, heritage language development stops at the basic level. There are several reasons for this: the use of traditional teaching methods in heritage language classes, and second, the negative reactions of fluent heritage language speakers who unjustly criticize imperfections in a young heritage language speaker's speech. But researchers strongly suggest that there is a powerful means of developing the heritage language that is not only effective, but also very pleasant. That would be self-selected pleasure reading in the heritage language. The factor preventing us from taking advantage of pleasure reading is the lack of interesting, comprehensible reading material in bookstores and libraries, a problem that is easy to solve. And we also learned yesterday that we can create our resources in multilingual languages. So I think combining the knowledge from today that we will gain with what we already know from yesterday may actually be a great solution to some of the challenges that are experienced by heritage language teachers, schools, and coalitions around the world. And Professor Stephen Krashen is an American linguist, educational researcher, and activist who is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Southern California. He obtained his PhD in linguistics from the University of California, and then he moved to the School of Education in the early 90s. Professor Krashen published more than 486 publications, including papers and books contributing to the fields of second language acquisition and bilingual education. He developed well-known hypotheses related to second language acquisition, including the comprehensible input hypothesis that some of you may know if you went through linguistic studies. Most recently, Professor Krashen promotes the use of free voluntary reading during second language acquisition, which is, as he promotes, the most powerful we have in language education, first and second. Many of his books and articles are available for free download at sdkrashen.com, and he also invites us all to follow him on Twitter as Krashen. And now some information about Dr. Nooshan Ashtari. She has contributed to the fields of technology and language education, sociolinguistics, and heritage language development, among others. She has taught and conducted research in various countries around the world for over 15 years. Her current research interests include virtual reality in teacher training and professional development, heritage language acquisition, and reading in second language acquisition. Her hope is that her research will help ensure that children of immigrants can communicate easily with their parents, grandparents, and relatives in their heritage language. That sounds very interesting. I think we are looking forward to see your presentation. And just before we start, I would like to ask you once again to mute your microphones for the time of the talk, and please use the chat box if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to begin by doing a quick summary of what I've been doing for the last 45 years. Actually, I've gotten quite a bit done in the last couple of years, especially. The last couple of years, I have been home. I have been home, staying home. I tell people I'm home alone with my girlfriend, which is lots of fun. We've only been married for 55 years, so we're still doing very, very well. And I'm getting a lot of work done, and I want to tell you all about it. I can explain the theory the easy way by telling you about what about my adventures at the local supermarket. I live about 10 miles away. How many kilometers is that? From the local supermarket, and they have a method that's good for old people. At 6:30 in the morning, you can only go to the supermarket if you're 65 years or older, which is wonderful because nobody else is there. That's what I've been doing every Friday morning. The first time I got there, I got my groceries, I stood in line and I noticed that the person working to check out your groceries and charge you had his name on his jacket, and his name was Fidel. So I assumed he was from Mexico, which was true, and I assumed he spoke Spanish. So of course I spoke Spanish to him. Now my Spanish is not that good. It's like language 4 or 5. You know how it is with people like us, but I did it anyway. He answered me in English. I found out later he's required to do that no matter what people talk to, answer in English. But I was ready. I said, Fidel, tú puedes ayudarme. You can help me. Mi meta es hablar español como ustedes. I want to learn to speak Spanish the way you do. Please, hablamos español. He loved it. We've been speaking Spanish for the last year and a half, every Friday morning early. And you know what? I'm getting better. But I'm not getting better from conversations with Fidel. I can only talk to him for about a minute. Oh, by the way, one of the reasons I know I'm getting better, our conversations have gotten more interesting. We've gone from hablar, just to speak, charlar, which is more like gossip, and we talk about other people. We get this all done in about a minute and a half. The great quote from Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, if you have something you want to say about someone and it's not good, please come sit next to me. So we've been talking about people, getting in some good gossip, and I'm getting better. And he's speaking more quickly. He's using more idiomatic language. I'm getting better, not from talking to Fidel. I don't have a lot of time to talk to him. I don't get that much input. I'm getting better because when I go home, I've been taking the advice of my colleague Benico Mason, and I've been reading lots and lots of very easy books in Spanish, what we call graded readers. I have a good collection. I now have favorite authors. I'll tell you about them. Adriana Ramirez is my favorite right now. She is from Bogota, and she writes about her hometown and adventures there. I'll tell you about one story. So you see how good this stuff is getting. It's becoming literature. That's the good news. It's a story of a young man who's in Bogota, a high school student. He's had a little bit of Spanish in the United States, all grammar, and can't really say very much. And he has to find some friends of his at another hotel, and he gets lost. So he sees another young man, says, "Can you help me?" In his poor Spanish, "Sure, I take you there. I know where the hotel is. Let's walk. I'll bring you." They start walking. They run into two beautiful young ladies. See how this gets interesting right away. The young ladies go rushing up to his new guide, give him hugs, give him kisses on the cheek, and hold his hand. Then he introduces the young lady to the narrator of the story. They give him hugs and hold his hand. They go walking to the hotel, not very far, and the guide says goodbye. And he says to the narrator, "I suppose you're wondering what's going on here. There's nothing exciting. These are my cousins. I've known them my entire life, and this is the way we are in Bogota. We're very physical. We do a lot of hugging. We're very warm." What Ramirez does in these novels is explain to you the culture in the form of interesting anecdotes and weaves a story around it. So things are getting much, much better. Let me tell you what I'm not doing to get better in Spanish. Well, I've run into a few friends of mine that I used to speak Spanish with, and I'm speaking Spanish to them. They say, "Steve, your Spanish is so much better. What have you been doing?" It's just reading these books, lots and lots of easy ones. I have now given most of my talk already. I'm now going to restate it in more boring language because that's what you're supposed to do when you're a college professor. So I'll do that. The last 45 years has been dominated by one hypothesis. We acquire language when we understand it. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us and we understand what we read. It's called comprehensible input. And the people knew about that before me. I just rediscovered it, okay? Not my original ideas, but I really think it is absolutely true. And today, what I'm going to focus on, we're going to focus on is one form of comprehensible input, reading. I'm really going to talk about the incredible power of self-selected pleasure reading. What we know from the research, people who read more spell better, read better, write better, have better grammar, everything related to language, they do better. This is all in one of my books called The Power of Reading, back from 2004. And please feel free to download it and share it with your friends. Uh, uh, those of you who want to know what's going on in the publishing world, you don't make any money from this stuff anyway, and the books are just vastly overpriced. So I think scholars like myself are much better off making it available to everybody for free. The best input for language acquisition is, yes, comprehensible, but also very, very interesting. I like the word compelling. Compelling means so interesting, you're no longer aware that it's in another language if it's another language. I want to tell you about one of the many studies. It's one of my favorites. It was done by one of my former students, Fei Xin. So a number of very interesting papers. In this one, it's about a former ESL student who is now comfortable in the language of the country, English. She's a native speaker of Mandarin, Putonghua. And the school she went to in high school, when you came to school, they gave you a test every fall when the school year began to see how good you are. And then at the end of the year, they gave you another test to see how much you've improved. This young lady, when she took the test at the end of the year, did worse. Her English actually got worse through the academic year. Then she would go home for summer vacation, come back, and she was better than she was the previous year, the previous fall. What was she doing over the summer? Well, I'm sure you figured it out. She went to the local public library, sat in a nice air-conditioned room, and read interesting books popular with teenagers. She read from the Sweet Valley High series. She read the Nancy Drew mystery stories. I've read these things. They're really quite good, if you ask me. That's how she got better. She averaged 50 books over the summer. This is a wonderful study. This is what caused the gain. During the school year, all the study didn't really do her much good. In fact, she got worse. So I want to emphasize one part of this for our heritage language people. Self-selection. Self-selected reading is really, I think, crucial. Self-selection guarantees that the books will be interesting and guarantees that they'll be comprehensible. You selected it yourself. If you don't like it, you can put it down and find another one. This is a guarantee that it's going to work. The evidence for this is available in boring technical studies. I want to give you the common sense. What happens when someone gives you a book as a present, as a gift? When I get a book as a present, I don't read it. I like to read books that I choose myself. And you worry about what's going to happen when your friend comes up to you a week later and says, "How did you like that book I gave you?" And you haven't read it. It's sitting on your shelf with all the other gift books staring down at you, making you feel guilty until you have the energy to donate it to the library. Gift books are assigned reading, just like in school. That's why they don't work. I just lost my screen. Give me a moment. Put in my granddaughter's name and the year I was born, and I'll get it. Okay, got it. So it is self-selected that really, really counts. Okay. I'll tell you about my experience in secondary school, in high school, and I'm betting the same thing happened to you. When I went to secondary school, this was in the United States, we had required language arts. One year we did American literature. One year we did British literature. I read all the books that were assigned. I took the examination. I did the assignments. I passed every one of them. I don't remember a single assigned book that I read for those classes, and you probably don't either. I went home and I read books that I wanted to read. And I had my own language arts program, and so did you. And that made you the literate person you are today. I read science fiction. I read Isaac Asimov. I read Robert Heinlein. I remember them to this day. They were wonderful. And I read baseball stories. There were these baseball novels by one author, John R. Tunis, Tunis. The stories were magnificent. I'll tell you just about his first one, called The Kid from Tompkinsville, about a teenager who gets to play baseball in the major leagues. He's only 19 years old. He becomes a pitcher, the one who throws the ball, batter tries to hit it. He's doing beautifully. He wins his first 19 games, unprecedented, unheard of. Then he slips and falls in the shower and hurts his elbow. He can't pitch anymore. He can't do the complicated moves. He can throw the ball fine. He comes back the next year as just a regular baseball player, playing another position. Turns out he's wonderful. 3 years later, he was the best hitter in baseball. This book was reviewed in the literature journal, and the reviewer said, "This is the boy's book of Job. This is having tragedy and recovering from tragedy again and again." So this is what I grew up on. This was my literature. Let me just give you a couple of case histories about heritage language students, and then I will turn the podium over to Dr. Ashtari. Lucy Say did a wonderful paper on this. Again, another former student. Wow, I've had such good luck with students. Lucy Say wrote a paper in which she talked about 10 formerly immigrant students who spoke heritage languages. They were born in the United States, 9 out of 10. She interviewed them when they were in their late teens, early 20s. They had all spent all their life in the United States. They all spoke the heritage languages very well. Native level competence. They were the success stories that we dream about for our students. None of them spent time or had education in the language, in the country where the language was spoken. What did they do? Reading, pleasure reading, self-selected. Nearly all the participants developed an interest in reading for pleasure, which they said was the reason they did so well when they grew up. Their reading included light reading from their parents, magazines, comic books. How do you like that? And all self-selected, recommended by parents or self-selected. They read novels, magazines, borrowed them from friends, from their parents. For the most part, I love the last sentence of the handout there. The participants read fiction for pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, fiction is magic. I have to tell you how I discovered fiction. I live about 30 minutes from Los Angeles, and I used to go there twice a week regularly, 30-minute drive up, 30-minute back, for two important reasons. Number one, like many of you, I was, and I still am, addicted to my grandchildren, so I had to go to the city to see my grandchildren, and I went to Venice Beach, otherwise known as Muscle Beach, to lift weights, as we said, pump iron. And I had a chance to talk to, this is name dropping, I had a chance to meet and talk to Arnold Schwarzenegger, who worked out the same place we did and talked to us and gave us lots of good advice. Arnold would come up to you, you're doing your bench presses, and he said, "Oh, try it this way. Let me help you with that." Arnold was such a good guy, I got to tell you. Anyway, what do you do in the car for 30 minutes up, 30 minutes back, twice a week? I started by listening to the radio, but the radio even then was all Donald Trump, so I gave up. I wanted to listen to music, and I wanted to hear the classic composers. My background is in music history, and I wanted to hear the composers like Brahms Beethoven, Chopin, the Beatles, the Bee Gees, all the great composers. Do you know what they did? They took all the good music and they put it on radio stations that you had to pay for. So I didn't do that. Instead, I stopped at the Santa Monica Library. My daughter worked there. I could say hello to her. And I looked at the section of audiobooks. There's a section of popular best-selling books. That's what I did. I took out discs, I got recordings of popular literature. They didn't have classics. They didn't have books in other languages. So I did popular reading in English. Guess what? They were good. Most of popular literature, I found very pleasantly surprised, was excellent. I began, of course, with Harry Potter. I listened to all 7 Harry Potter novels, which were wonderful. They were written for us because they're all about education. The hero in one of them is the headmaster of Hogwarts, Dumbledore. So that was absolutely great. I read historical romances. I read legal novels, things like that. Most of them very, very well done. That's where I got the idea. Think language education on fiction. A synonym for fiction, novels, light reading, stories. That's what it's about. Let me give you one more case. This is Grace Cho. Grace Cho, another former student, became a professor at California State University. Grace Cho was a native speaker of Korean. That was her specialty. And in her neighborhood, she and her family went to a local social event at a neighbor's house. And she discovered that many of the people there were Korean American. Young people, older people, average age in their 30s. She noticed that many of them spoke Korean very, very well. Grace Cho did something clever. She arranged to have interviews. She interviewed them, and here's what she found. She found that of the 7 she interviewed, 5 out of 7 were dedicated readers in Korean. And 3 of them gave reading the credit. One student, Howard, I read every day. I got hooked on Chinese novels translated into Korean, read 3 to 4 hours a day, etc. Another one, Tony, became a professional translator. This is someone who did not grow up in Korea. This is all done in the US. He said, and Dr. Ashtari will confirm this, Korean language classes didn't help much. I maintained Korean from reading books, magazines, newspapers, watching Korean dramas. Korean dramas are world famous and for very good reason. I've seen a number of them with English subtitles. They're absolutely wonderful, wonderful. Well, this is my contribution to this discussion. To make a long story very short, it's self-selected reading of popular literature fiction. By the way, here in my 2 years alone at home, I've made some more discoveries. I found out fiction is even better for us than we thought. Fiction, of course, gives you a great deal of language, vocabulary, grammar, no question. To my amazement, there are excellent studies that show the more fiction you read, the more you know. The more you know about history, social studies, politics, technology. The novels have a huge amount of information. I discovered this when I was asked to show up for jury duty. If you're a voter, you have to do this every couple of years. I went to the jury to watch a trial and make a judgment. And because I was a college professor, they made me the head of the jury, the foreman. Bad move. I was terrible. I really didn't know what I was doing. If I had read John Grisham's book, The Runaway Jury, I would have done a much better job. Justice would have been served. That's where you get the information. One more point I want to tell you about my cousin Evelyn. My cousin Evelyn is the classic, wonderful older cousin we all hope we have. She's in her 90s now, and we've always been great friends. Evelyn told me her husband passed away, Marty, who was also a wonderful guy. He was a lawyer. He actually had a law degree. And Evelyn said, you know, Martin knows so much about law. I want to find out more about law. I'm going to take a class in legal terminology. I said, Evelyn, try reading John Grisham novels. She did it. After reading 5 or 6 novels, she said, this is like a year of law school. Absolutely right. By the way, I've been buying and sending these novels to Evelyn, and I can take the expense off my taxes because I'm telling you about this. It's now part of my professional career and knowledge. Fiction does language, gives you all kinds of information about the world and more. Let me now turn the platform over to my esteemed colleague, Nooshan Ashtari, who will tell you the problems, why we have trouble reaching higher levels in heritage languages. So, Dr. Ashtari.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krashen. You're completely right. It's both heartwarming and heartbreaking when we hear stories about heritage language acquirers and their experiences in different languages around the world. And what is interesting is that in research, whether it's research that we've read or we've done or any kind of research that we see, there are common themes that come across over and over again in terms of the barriers that we see when it comes to heritage language development. One of them is heritage language classes, as you mentioned, in Korean and all the other languages. First of all, they're not very common in general. You don't have that many heritage language classes around the world. In some major cities with very large populations of immigrants, there are some of them here and there. But even the ones that we do have available are not very effective. One of the main reasons why they're not very effective is that they're very traditionally taught. So for instance, the methods that they're using are either grammar translation or audiolingual, very, very dry in terms of, for example, languages that don't have the same alphabet system or Latin-based system of Romance languages. A lot of times the first year or even like 6 months to a year, it's a lot of emphasis on trying to teach the alphabet system, reading words and phonics and things like that. And those kinds of instructions of having the students go through a lot of testing and memorizing things and grammar structures, they do not only not help, but they also push the students away from wanting to go to these classes and acquire the languages. As you can see here, we have some quotes from some interviews that we've done. I am originally from Iran. I was born and raised in Tehran, Iran. I moved to the US for my graduate studies. And once I got here, I noticed that there are a lot of Persian families that are complaining and nagging about their children or grandchildren not speaking Farsi, not being able to connect with the culture. And I started noticing that there are patterns. So I started interviewing them every now and then. And these are some of the quotes that they told me. First of all, none of them found the heritage language classes that they were signed up for and registered for and sent to helpful at all. And they mentioned that a lot of these classes were either on Friday evenings or during weekends after school hours, that they just wanted to, have fun or be with their friends, and they didn't want to be forced to go to any of these classes. And some of them even explained that they were daunting, impossible, very difficult to sit through. And that has been the case across the board in different heritage language classes as well. And as you see here, one of the students' reaction was that it actually pushed me away. I did not want to go to any of the other heritage language classes or be as interactive in my heritage language and culture after those. There are also some college and university level heritage language classes or classes that could qualify as heritage language classes. And when we look at the description of those courses, they are very, very similar to those classes, or even sometimes worse, because they're very much more assessment focused. Grammar structures, advanced grammar, formal writing, very very dry in terms of the way that they are constructed and taught to the students. Another barrier is also the reactions of fluent speakers of those heritage languages. So Dr. Krashen talked about it in 1998 and termed it as language shyness. What language shyness means is that when a heritage language speaker can speak the language, but they cannot speak it perfectly. So there are some errors here and there. For instance, in some languages such as mine, there are two versions of you. A formal you that you use for people who are older than you as a sign of respect, people that you don't know very well. And there's an informal you that you use for conversations with friends or people that you're more comfortable with. And if you, for example, switch these in terms of the culture, it's not really something that some people might appreciate, but they get, when it comes to heritage language acquirers, they get very negative reactions. Or, for example, minor grammar errors, word usage errors, very, very minor errors that if they were second language speakers in that language and not originally from that culture or language, they would be more open about, for example, if they made that error, they would just, other people would not react as negatively to them. And I think that a lot of people, especially when it comes to heritage languages, are well-meaning. They think that, oh, this person is from this culture, from this language, so I need to help them, speak the language perfectly. But in reality, what happens is that they actually have the exact opposite effect on heritage language acquirers. As you can see in these two quotes from Spanish and Persian, it says, I began to realize that I spoke Spanish to my relatives. They would constantly correct my grammar or pronunciation. My relatives would say, you would never know that you're the daughter of a 17. Comments like these. Also in Persian, it's like a tug of war. I feel like my parents want me to speak Persian, but then they turn around and criticize me when I'm not perfect. And then you go to a Persian, mehmuni, which is a word for party in Farsi. And then the older generation, they kind of look down on you and it feels horrible. So again, I don't think that they have bad intentions when they do that. But at the same time, it really does not help heritage language acquirers connect with the language and culture and want to be more involved in it. So definitely that's something that has very negative reactions on heritage language acquirers. The third barrier is lack of access to books or interesting, compelling, comprehensible reading materials. We are very privileged in Los Angeles because it's the city with the highest number of Iranians living outside of the country. And we have 4 bookstores, Farsi bookstores in LA, which is unheard of anywhere else in the world, which actually, when I did this study in 2020, I think I did it in 2019. It was published in 2020. It was before the pandemic. So from what I've heard, a lot of those businesses have suffered. So I'm not sure if we have the 4 anymore. I think we still have like 2 of them, but not as well as it used to be. But we do have some Farsi bookstores in Los Angeles, and even the ones that are available and the books that are available, they're very dense and too difficult for heritage language acquirers. So if you remember the comprehensible input hypothesis, we need to have input that is at and slightly higher than our level of proficiency so that our brain can level up and learn the language and acquire the language more. So if it's too difficult for language acquirers, then it's not going to be as helpful to them. And there were no graded or very few graded or simple books available in any of those bookstores, and many of them were only for native speakers. So for instance, there were very classic poetry books, political books, economics books, very difficult in terms of the topic and also the level of the language that is used in those books to be able to be used for language acquisition. Also, we were looking at public libraries. There are 72 public branches of libraries in Los Angeles. And out of the millions of people who are Iranian heritage and live in the area, the books that were available for them in these libraries were only 300. So very, very small number of books, and also the books that are available not being very effective for language acquisition. We also wanted to see, now that we know we don't have that many books and reading materials available, we also wanted to see how much of these materials that we do have available have actually been read and used. We use this method called unobtrusive measures, and Dr. Jeff McCullin, who is also a student of Dr. Krashen's, he used this method in 2008 to see language instruction books in general. So he went to the library and took out as many language instruction books that he could find in 6 different languages and looked at the last page that was read. This is a very interesting method. So you can look at this from the books that you have at home, but it's more clear when it comes to books in the libraries because there are so many people using them. You can kind of tell on which page the readers have stopped reading. We call it the wear and tear index. So you look for any kind of wrinkles, fingerprints, coffee or tea stains, and separations of pages. So you can kind of tell that, you know, the new pages that have not been turned versus the pages that have been turned. And their study, Dr. McCullin's study, they found that across the board in all these different languages, only 16.8% of these books were read. So if you think about it, it's only maybe 1 chapter or 2 chapters, and then the books were returned. We wanted to see what this percentage would be for Farsi books. And it turned out that it's even less. It was only 5%. So maybe a few pages of each of the books were read, and then the books were returned to the library. So that also shows us that even the books, even the reading materials that we do have available are not very helpful. With that, we also wanted to look at, I think if you scroll down a little bit, over here. Oh, thank you. Okay, so wrapping up the conclusions of these. So 3 main barriers to heritage language acquisition, as we talked about heritage language classes not being very helpful in terms of the teaching methodologies that they use. We don't have much access to interesting, comprehensible, compelling reading materials in different languages across the word, and we do need to be better in terms of that, and also reactions of more advanced speakers or native speakers of these languages, being more open, not overcorrecting, even though it might be with good intentions, it's not really helping. So being very, very open, being able to share the information, speak in the language, not necessarily always require the heritage language acquirer to always speak back in the heritage language. So making sure that they're getting a lot of compelling, comprehensible input so that they can actually develop that connection and understanding of the language and go over the different proficiency levels with that, so that they go beyond the basic level of proficiency that we see in research in terms of heritage language development. So those are the barriers, but that does not mean that there's not going to be any solutions or ways that we can handle them and we can be better at facing these barriers. Some of the solutions that we can definitely think about and look into and implement are using more comprehensible input-based pedagogy, for instance, stories. We've had research over the past 40 plus years in terms of how effective stories and story listening and story reading can be for language acquisition. Because when you think about it, when you read a language instruction book or things that are more grammar, very, very dense, you're kind of studying the language, versus in stories, you are reading very similar structures. They have conversations, there are people, characters in the stories, and you're kind of immersed, you're kind of part of that story. You can see yourself through the eyes of different characters. You're kind of very engaged. It's very compelling. And as you're reading the story, you're figuring out what the characters are doing, what the storyline is. You're also acquiring the language. Dr. Beniko Mason, as Dr. Krashen mentioned, has done amazing research on story listening and self-selected pleasure reading. So those are very good options to use in our heritage language classes with heritage language acquirers in general, reading them stories, telling them stories in the heritage language, and not expecting them to be as responsive as we hope them to be, just so that they're more engaged, interested, and they're acquiring the language. Also having small free libraries. And this libraries, I know that there's a workshop after this about creating libraries. They don't have to be very extensive of, we have to have like this many books or these many stories available. They can be virtual, they can be PDFs, they can be very small sharing of different versions of different reading materials that everyone has available, and that kind of builds on itself. So starting small, and then it's going to expand. And also educating parents and other speakers of those heritage languages in terms of the theory and language shyness, second language acquisition, all of those things, as it doesn't have to be extensive classes or extensive instruction about them, but so that they know that those reactions, those ways of approaching heritage languages can have negative and positive effects depending on how they go about them. So with all of that being said, these are very small and medium-sized steps that we can take in order to have more heritage language acquisition in the word and pass our heritage languages to the next and current generations. So I believe with that, we are going to open the floor up for any thoughts, comments, and questions that the audience might have.
Thank you very much, Professor Krashen and Dr. Ashtari, for this really interesting set of ideas. I think there's a lot of food for thought in both the talks. We had some comments coming in, and please, if you have any questions, do add them now to the chat as well. I've got some on my list as well. The first one that appeared from the audience was about reading online for research, for projects, non-fiction as well as fiction. Is this something that should be promoted, as young people seem to be more attracted to digital medium? Could you please share with us what your thoughts on the online reading are?
Okay, I'll share with you what has been said about it, which I think is very wise. Some authors have come to the conclusion, researchers, that reading online is tough. When it has to do, when it's light fiction, it's fine. But if it's technical stuff, the kind of boring junk that I write, it helps to have it on paper. It helps to make notes, etc., so you could think it through. So the thinking about it has just begun. I think we're going to need absolutely both. It's a wonderful question, a wonderful one to research. Thanks for asking it.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
A very quick addition to that. I think it is also a generational thing, as you mentioned, that I'm also very comfortable with paper. I feel like I learn more when I'm reading on paper, but I compare myself to my nieces and nephews and a younger generation, and they're much more comfortable reading online. I think at the core of it, it's the comfort level, and the more input they get, no matter if it's online or if it's on paper, the better for language acquisition. So which is our final goal. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but what about, because you mentioned that the level of difficulty should be a little bit above the current level of the reader. Are there any basic guidelines for how to decide? Or on the other hand, what is the sort of in percentages, if possible, or maybe there's another way to assess how much vocabulary of a given book needs to be known to the reader to enable him to not only comprehend, but also develop the language?
Okay. I have a cheerful answer to this. I worried about it too for a long time until I took a ride on the Pasadena freeway in California So I refer to this as the Pasadena Freeway Hypothesis. Here's what I was so excited about this. I got off the freeway and had to write it down, fortunately. If you read a lot, the structures you are ready to acquire are automatically there. It's kind of like the balanced diet theory. Remember back in the old days when I was a bodybuilder and did all this, we were very interested in what the new vitamins were. So they just discovered selenium and vitamin B12. So we went out and got pills. And then we found out if you have a good diet and the food is well prepared and there's a variety, you're going to get everything you need. It's the same idea. Read what you like, read a lot, let you grow with your interests, and what you're going to need is going to be there. I don't think it's a good idea to try to target certain structures that we think people are going to need. Let them follow their interests and they'll get it all. That's the hypothesis anyway.
Mm-hmm. Because we know that for some languages, at least, we've got the graded readers, and you can, adapt it. So it's a decision of the teacher at some point as well. And teachers tend to worry if they are not overdoing things, especially that you've got these precious hours when the children are at school. And this will lead to another question. We can see from the comments that well, the story of the Farsi school I'm gathering that Dr. Ashtari mentioned, was something that disappointed many, because many of us, I think, are involved in heritage language schools, and we try to get to know new methods. I myself know of plenty schools and teacher groups that organize training so that they are up to date with all the teaching methods and so on. And the fact that children are not approaching the heritage language schools enthusiastically is a reason to worry always. But was that research done just for a Farsi community, or was that part of a bigger research? If you can elaborate on that.
The one that, thank you so much for that question. Great question. And I shared those disappointments myself, because I thought, when I first moved here and they were saying, the Persian families were telling me that their children are not acquiring and they don't like the heritage language class. I was like, no, they're great, send them. And then I did more research, like, maybe, there is something there. The ones that I have been working on, because my focus has been on Persian as a heritage language, have been focused on heritage language, but when I was doing research and literature reviews, there were common concerns in other heritage languages as well. So there are traces of them that are in different languages, and I think it goes back to, first of all, and I'm not sure if that is universal, but even in LA, the ones that I see, the teachers that are teaching those classes are also coming from very traditional backgrounds in teaching. So that also might have a direct effect on how these classes are perceived as well, that they think that a lot of the ones that I sat through or looked at the description of the classes, they were very similar to first grade classes that are taught in Iran for native speakers of Farsi, which is month and month of going through vocabulary, alphabet instruction, because it is a very different writing system compared to English. So if we're spending all that time on the alphabet, pronunciations, vocabulary list, grammar, it is going to not be as well received as very lively stories, talking about the culture, about interesting things about the language, things like that. So it is true that it is mostly geared towards Farsi, but as we've seen in researches in the research of Dr. Cho, Dr. Say, Dr. McQuillan, other heritage languages have also been suffering from same consequences. But I'm hoping that that's going to be changed, hopefully with all of our combined efforts, in order to make the content of those classes more and more interesting and comprehensible.
Well, I think there's plenty happening in order to improve the situation. We've got Joy commenting here on the fact that we need to work with those schools and turn them into classes engaging experiences, and conferences like this one, or the one that Joy hosted, and the community languages in states. Well, this is the fact that they are attracting so many participants is a good indicator that there is a need and there is an appetite for learning more and improving things, because we want to do the best, of course. But my question would be also, do you think there is still a place for this classics in any given language? Because as heritage language schools, we want to give the children, of course, the ability to learn the language and to develop it, the structures, the vocabulary, but also to share with them the achievements of the culture and literature of a given country. But that means often that the reading materials involved in the curriculum are of, well, more classical nature, sometimes outdated. The language is often, not that modern. Do you think there is still a place in heritage language education to get these assigned readings of the classical titles in literature of a given language, if it's still there?
Absolutely. I think we can definitely do it, but it has to be a more simplified language. And the way we approach it would be through, you know how in teaching we say scaffolding everything, a lot more of videos, different ways to approach the same materials. It's the core of the classics, for example, would stay the same if we're talking about classic poetry, classic literature, the big well-known names in those languages and cultures that we want the students to know about, we want them to be able to connect with. But sometimes, for example, when we're talking about beginner or low intermediate levels, those might be too tough, as you said, to swallow and be able to understand. Even as a native speaker, I sometimes read Persian poetry and I'm like, what happened? And I have no idea how they mean, or the words are too much, or the structure is like very different to what I'm used to as an everyday speaker of the language. So simplifying them, having them more for more upper intermediate advanced levels as its original form, those would be super helpful, because now we have structured things enough, we have scaffolded things enough that now they can understand them better. But for lower levels, having them more simplified or talking about them more rather than the direct facing of the classics would be super helpful. So approaching them differently is my suggestion. We could still keep them, but step by step, getting to the level of being able to read the originals and understand the originals.
That's a very good idea. And I think combining that with the tools of the Bloom library that we heard about yesterday, like preparing your own versions or with the class, your versions of the classics is something worth considering as well. We've got comments coming from all over Europe, and not only, I think, inviting us to Austria, for instance, to cook, dance, sing, read, act, and experiment during heritage language classes. And Aga as well is commenting on the fact that the children and teenagers in Irish schools, they really appreciated the heritage language programs, despite the fact that it is tiring and it is another day that we spend at school. If I may ask, because there is a question here, I think an interesting one as well, because we've mentioned the online books, we've mentioned the online reading, we've mentioned traditional reading, but the audiobooks as well. Is there some research that would compare the benefit of reading, of listening to audiobooks versus reading traditional books? Is the advantage still there, and does it differ between the two types, audiobooks versus traditional reading?
Well, I'm supposed to be an expert on the research. So thanks to my voluminous knowledge in reading, I'm an expert on everything. So I can give you the answer. I don't know of any. Please get going, start doing the research and tell us about it. It's a wonderful thing that we need. It's a gap that needs to be filled. Perfect question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think if we have our own children that were brought up in a country where their heritage language is a heritage language, it's always nice to see that the child is playing and there's an audiobook in the background, because it stays and it's not necessarily time dedicated for reading, but still you feel that there is something educational happening as well. And especially when a child wants it and they pick up their own audiobook or a traditional book. Well, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting. And I think there'll be plenty more ideas and questions that we share. Please do share them with us on the Padlet as well. I think more things of this sort may come up in our workshop that we'll invite you to join after the break. The handouts from this talk will be available on our website as well. And thank you very much once again for sharing all the experiences, the stories, the wisdom, and encouraging us to do more. And I think not just for the children, but I think everyone now feels that, yes, I need to do more reading.